The sun hung low over the Wyoming plains, casting long, fiery streaks across the endless horizon. Jake Callahan leaned against the worn railing of his cabin porch, chewing the end of a straw and squinting into the heat-hazed distance. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled to the dying day. Life on the frontier was lonely but predictable, until a distant wagon began kicking up clouds of dirt, rolling along the old wagon trail like an unexpected shadow on the land. At first, Jake thought it might be a passing traveler or one of the supply wagons from town. But as the wagon crept closer, he noticed it was smaller, nearly overloaded, and the driver seemed unusually tense. And then he saw her. A young woman sat perched on a battered seat, her hands clutching a small, worn trunk. Her bonnet was askew, and her eyes darted nervously at the prairie around her, wide and searching, as if expecting the earth itself to swallow her up. There was something about her stance, hesitant, fragile, yet defiant, that made Jake pause. The wagon jerked and groaned over the uneven trail, wheels splintering slightly against rocks and ruts. The driver, a man Jake knew only by reputation, his neighbor, a wealthy rancher, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a heavy silence filled the air around the wagon, broken only by the creak of wood and the occasional rattle of chains. The woman looked toward the cabins that dotted the trail, her lips moving as if she were whispering to herself. The sight of her there, stranded alone, made Jake's gut tighten. Something told him she wasn't just lost, she was abandoned, left like a message nobody wanted to deliver. As the wagon neared the edge of the Callahan property, Jake noticed the signs of recent struggle. The harness straps were frayed, and the small trunk she carried had scratches along its edges, like it had been dragged across the ground more than once. Dust clung to her skirts and her boots were caked in mud, though the land around here had been dry for weeks. She was a stranger to him, yes, but there was an urgency in her movements, a desperate need to keep moving forward. And yet, she paused for a brief moment to glance back at the empty trail she'd traveled, and her eyes were filled with fear. Fear of someone, or something, that might follow. Jake's heart kicked up a notch. He'd seen a lot in his years on the frontier, but a woman alone out here, abandoned by the man who was supposed to welcome her, was something new. There was a storm brewing in her gaze, a story she wasn't ready to tell yet. And though the Wyoming plains were vast, empty, and unforgiving, he knew instinctively that the moment she stepped down from that wagon, life at his cabin, once quiet, solitary, predictable, was about to change forever. Jake watched her hesitate at the edge of his property, her small trunk clutched tight against her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. The wind tugged at her skirts, whipping strands of hair across her face, but she barely brushed them aside. He could see the uncertainty in her movements, the way her shoulders tensed, the slight tremor in her hands. Most men in town would have turned away, thinking it none of their business. But something in Jake's gut told him he couldn't. He knew the dangers she faced, the lawless men who preyed on the weak, the brutal indifference of the frontier, and he couldn't let her face them alone. He called out, his voice steady but low, carrying just enough to reach her without startling her. "You lookin' for shelter? You can stay at my cabin. Ain't far from here, and it's warm tonight." There was a pause. She froze, her wide eyes scanning the cabin and the empty land around it, as if weighing whether to trust this stranger who spoke with such calm authority. The dust swirled around her feet, catching in the fading light, and for a moment she seemed ready to run back down the trail. But the shadows in the distance, long and uncertain, hinted at dangers she'd rather face by trusting someone than by fleeing alone. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded, barely, and stepped toward him, the trunk dragging slightly on the ground behind her. Every step she took made Jake more aware of her vulnerability, yet also of her quiet strength. There was a resilience in the way she balanced herself, a determination not to be broken despite the abandonment she'd endured. He opened the cabin door for her, stepping aside, letting her move in first, and she paused once more at the threshold, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of suspicion and hope. Jake offered her a small, reassuring nod, silently promising she would be safe inside these timber walls. The cabin itself was modest, just one room with rough timber walls, a hearth that had seen many winters, and a few pieces of worn furniture. The fire was already lit, crackling and casting shadows across the wooden floorboards. Jake motioned toward a corner where blankets had been folded neatly, and she moved toward it, setting her trunk down with a careful thud. She glanced around, noting the simplicity and solitude of the place, but also the warmth. It wasn't much, but it was a shelter from the cold, from the dust, from the threat of the outside world. For the first time, she allowed herself to exhale, a slow, shaky breath that seemed to carry the weight of all she'd endured. Jake watched her, quiet, patient, and ready to respond if she needed anything. He didn't press her to speak, didn't ask her story yet. He only offered his presence, a silent protection that she could either accept or reject. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside, the cabin was a small fortress against the unknown. And as she sat down near the hearth, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames, Jake realized that in this moment, the choice he had made, to step forward when others would have turned away, might change both their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The first night in Jake's cabin was quieter than Clara had expected. The wind rattled the shutters and whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the distant calls of coyotes and the soft rustle of prairie grass. Every sound made her flinch. She clutched her blanket tightly around her shoulders, eyes darting to the corners of the room where shadows seemed to creep along the walls like living things. Jake noticed her tension, but he didn't speak. He simply sat in his chair by the fire, letting the flames cast warmth and light, offering her a silent reassurance that she was no longer alone. Clara moved slowly around the cabin, exploring its small, rugged space. Every piece of furniture, every crack in the floorboards, seemed to whisper stories of the past, of lonely nights and long winters, of survival and hardship. She placed her trunk carefully near the far wall, as if creating a barrier between herself and the outside world. Her hands lingered over the worn wood, tracing the grooves with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. It was a cabin built for protection, yet in the flickering firelight, it felt both comforting and haunted, like the walls themselves were aware of the dangers that lurked just beyond the door. As the night grew deeper, Clara began to notice small, unsettling details she hadn't at first: the way the firelight cast strange, shifting shadows across the floor, the way the wind's howl sounded almost like whispers pressing against the cabin's walls. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to burst in. Jake had said nothing about the neighbor or the men who had abandoned her, but the air itself seemed to carry a warning. She realized with a sinking feeling that this cabin was safe only as long as she trusted him, and trusting someone she barely knew, after everything she had endured, was harder than crossing the desert alone. Jake watched her movements with quiet patience, noting how every sound outside seemed to make her flinch. He had spent years alone in this cabin and knew how quickly a woman unused to the frontier could feel vulnerable. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice low but firm, as she jumped slightly at a branch scraping against the window. "Nothing out there's gonna hurt you tonight." Clara's gaze met his, searching for deceit, for some hidden threat, but she found only calm and steadiness. Still, the shadows on the walls and the wind beyond the cabin kept her on edge, like a predator might be circling just out of sight. Hours passed with the fire crackling and the wind moaning outside. Clara sat close to it, warming her hands, listening to the symphony of the frontier night. In that silence she felt both relief and unease. Relief because she was no longer alone on a vast, empty prairie; unease because she realized the night held secrets that she couldn't yet see. The cabin was a sanctuary, yes, but the shadows seemed to whisper reminders danger wasn't gone, it was merely waiting, lurking in the darkness, patient and silent, just beyond the flickering light. The following days were deceptively calm, but the prairie has a way of hiding dangers in plain sight. Jake noticed it first: tracks in the dirt around his cabin that didn't belong to his own horse, small prints that vanished and reappeared as if someone were circling, watching. Clara seemed unaware at first, tending to chores and unpacking her few belongings, but Jake couldn't ignore the sense of unease settling over the land. The wind carried rumors too, whispers that seemed to cling to the edges of the cabin like smoke. Some came from travelers passing through, some from distant ranches, but every voice carried the same warning: whoever had abandoned her wasn't likely finished. At the edge of the woods, Jake spotted figures on horseback in the distance. At first, they seemed like ordinary riders making their way across the prairie, but their movements were deliberate, calculated, almost predatory. They slowed whenever he approached the ridge, their faces hidden beneath broad hats, eyes scanning the horizon. It was the kind of vigilance that spoke of dangerous intentions, the type of men who didn't leave loose ends. Jake didn't say anything to Clara yet; he wanted to be sure, to observe without drawing attention. But the unease in his chest told him that this calm was fragile. Clara began noticing subtle signs herself: horses pawing at the ground far off in the distance, the occasional shadow flickering across the prairie, the sound of whispers carried by the wind that seemed almost human. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was only her imagination, only the fears of a woman who had been abandoned and betrayed. But deep down, she knew the prairie was speaking to her. Danger was near, hidden in the tall grass and ridges, waiting for a moment to strike. The stories she'd heard in town about reckless men and ruthless ranchers suddenly didn't seem like exaggerations. They were warnings. Jake started taking extra precautions. He tied the cabin doors securely each night, checked his rifle, and kept a watchful eye on the horizon. He didn't want to alarm Clara, but he couldn't ignore the signs. He knew these men. They weren't just ordinary troublemakers. They were the kind who settled scores in blood, the kind who believed ownership extended beyond property to people. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the prairie grass, made him tighten his grip on reality. He felt the weight of responsibility heavier than he had ever imagined, knowing that the fragile trust forming between him and Clara could be shattered in an instant. By the fourth night, the tension had thickened to an almost tangible level. Clara no longer moved freely around the cabin. She stayed near the hearth, glancing at the window and listening to the prairie with wide, fearful eyes. Jake could see the anxiety etched into her features, the way her fingers lingered over the edge of the blankets as if to steady herself. He wanted to tell her she was safe, that the cabin was a fortress, but even he knew the truth. The prairie didn't forget, and danger had a long memory. And somewhere out there, on the ridge or in the shadowed valleys beyond, the men who had abandoned her were waiting, watching, calculating their next move. The storm hit without warning. Rain hammered the cabin's roof, and gusts rattled the walls as if the prairie itself were shaking with menace. Clara sat close to the fire, her knees drawn up, staring into the flames, but her thoughts were elsewhere, haunted by the reasons she had been abandoned. The tension that had been building over the past days seemed to settle like a heavy weight on her shoulders, pressing her to speak. She glanced at Jake, who was busy patching the roof's loose shingles, but the determined set of his jaw and the calm steadiness in his movements gave her courage. Slowly she began to talk. She spoke in low, hesitant words, almost as if admitting the truth would make it more real. The neighbor who had rejected her was not a man of simple disinterest. He was deeply entangled in debts with men from Cheyenne, dangerous men who did not forgive. Clara's voice trembled as she explained that her supposed marriage had been a transaction, a settlement to repay a gambling debt that had nothing to do with her. When she had refused to comply, they threatened her, swearing they would take her back by force if necessary. The weight of the frontier's harsh realities pressed down on her words, revealing the brutality she had narrowly escaped. Jake listened, silent, letting the story unfold like a slow, deliberate drumbeat in the storm. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also the quiet fire she carried. The stubborn refusal to be treated like property. Each word painted a clearer picture of the danger lurking beyond the cabin walls, the threat that was patient, calculating, and unyielding. Clara's voice grew steadier as she spoke, each detail etching a map of peril across the Wyoming prairie. He realized that the man who had abandoned her had gambled with her life, and Clara had narrowly evaded becoming another pawn in a ruthless game. Outside, the storm intensified, matching the tension inside the cabin. Thunder rolled across the plains like distant cannon fire, and the wind carried branches that scratched and battered the cabin walls. Clara's revelation seemed to give the storm a voice, as if the land itself was echoing her fear. Jake felt the weight of responsibility like never before. He had offered her shelter out of a sense of decency and instinct, but now he understood that the stakes were far higher than he had imagined. Protection wasn't just a matter of firewood or blankets. It was survival against men who didn't hesitate to take what they believed was owed. As the fire flickered and cast long, jittering shadows across the cabin, Clara paused, looking at Jake with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Her story had opened a door she couldn't close, revealing the truth of why she had been left alone on that wagon. The frontier was unforgiving, and danger was patient, waiting just beyond the walls of the cabin for the perfect moment. For the first time, Jake realized the full scope of what he had stepped into by offering her refuge. The quiet isolation of his cabin was no longer a place of simple solitude. It had become a stage for the confrontation that was fast approaching, and the secrets she had revealed were the spark that would ignite it. The next evening, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. Clouds rolled low over the horizon, and the wind whispered through the grass like a warning. Jake had been keeping watch since sunset, eyes scanning the ridges and valleys for any sign of movement. Clara sat near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly, listening to every creak of the cabin and every gust of wind. The quiet of the approaching night made the tension unbearable. Each distant hoofbeat or snapping branch seemed amplified, a herald of the danger closing in. Then, in the dim light of dusk, he saw them, 3 riders emerging from the distant ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the fading sun. They moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the prairie with cold, calculating eyes. Jake recognized them instantly from Clara's story. These were the men who had claimed ownership over her, men who believed threats and violence were tools to get what they wanted. He stepped to the doorway, his rifle in hand, feeling the rough wood under his fingers as the wind tugged at his coat. "Stay inside," he called over his shoulder to Clara, his voice calm but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. The riders stopped 100 yards from the cabin, exchanging low words that Jake couldn't hear but could feel in the weight of their intent. One of them spurred his horse slightly, and it kicked up dirt in the twilight, a silent warning. Jake stood firm, planting his boots into the ground, his rifle leveled but ready. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, empty and cold, yet filled with a tension that seemed to press against every wall of the cabin. Clara peeked from behind a curtain, her eyes wide and her breath shallow, clutching the edge of the hearth as if her touch could hold the building together. Time seemed to slow. The riders shifted their weight, hands hovering near their pistols, daring Jake to make the first move. Jake's jaw tightened as he recalled Clara's story, the threats, the danger, the helplessness she had endured. But he also remembered the fire in her eyes, the resilience that had carried her across the prairie and into his cabin. He knew he couldn't let fear dictate the outcome. His voice broke the silence, low and unwavering. "She stays. If you want her, you'll have to come through me." The words hung in the air like gun smoke, final and resolute, signaling that there would be no negotiation. The wind picked up, scattering leaves and dust across the cabin yard. The riders exchanged glances, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed poised on the edge of violence. Clara's heartbeat echoed in Jake's ears, fast and irregular, matching the tension of the men outside. Every muscle in his body was taut, every sense alert, knowing the next moments could mean life or death. The prairie was silent except for the distant roll of thunder, the snap of a branch, and the soft creak of the cabin floor. The standoff had begun, and neither side was willing to back down. Dawn broke slowly over the Wyoming prairie, the horizon streaked with pale gold and smoky gray. The battle from the night before had left its mark: trampled grass, scattered debris, and the lingering scent of gunpowder that clung stubbornly to the air. Jake stood at the cabin doorway, his rifle resting at his side, eyes scanning the horizon for any remaining threat. Clara emerged cautiously from the cabin, her hands still shaking, tracing the fire, scorched edge of the hearth. The night had changed something between them. The fear and uncertainty had woven a thread of connection, fragile yet unbreakable. The men who had threatened Clara were gone, leaving behind only footprints in the soft earth and the echo of their intent. But their presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the dangers that still existed beyond the prairie. Jake moved beside Clara, keeping a watchful eye, but also noticing her resilience. She had faced fear head-on and survived, and in that she seemed transformed, stronger, more certain. For the first time she looked at him not as a stranger, not as a protector, but as someone who had earned her trust through quiet courage and unwavering resolve. They began clearing the remnants of the previous night, brambles and broken branches scattered around the cabin, the subtle marks of the standoff etched into the land. As they worked side by side, there was a growing rhythm to their movements, a silent understanding forming between them. Jake noticed how her hands moved with purpose, how she spoke softly but firmly about plans to repair the cabin, to make it truly a home. And in those shared tasks, the walls of fear and suspicion began to crumble, replaced by something warmer, something tender that neither of them had expected to find amidst the wilderness and danger. The morning air carried the distant calls of birds and the soft whisper of wind over the prairie. Clara paused, letting the light touch her face, and Jake realized she was no longer looking behind her, no longer haunted by the past. She had survived the threat, faced the unknown, and found herself here, standing beside him. He felt a strange sense of relief, not just that the danger had passed, but that this moment, simple and quiet, held the potential for something entirely new. In the aftermath of violence and fear, there was space for hope, for connection, and for love that had been waiting quietly all along. As the sun climbed higher, casting its golden warmth across the prairie, they paused together, gazing out at the horizon. The world beyond the cabin was still vast, still uncertain, but for the first time, they felt a sense of ownership over their own destiny. Clara leaned slightly into Jake's side, her hand brushing against his, tentative yet deliberate, and he responded with a steady, reassuring presence. In that small, rugged cabin at the edge of the frontier, amidst the scars of struggle and the shadows of past threats, something profound was taking root. A bond forged in adversity, tempered by courage, and strengthened by the promise of a future they would face together. As the prairie settled into quiet once more, the wind carrying only the soft rustle of grass and distant bird calls, Jake and Clara stood side by side, watching the horizon. The danger that had once loomed so close was gone, for now, but the trials they had faced had changed them both. In the heart of the wilderness, amidst shadows and storms, they had found something stronger than fear: trust, courage, and a love neither had expected. The cabin, once just a shelter from the harsh frontier, had become a home. Its walls had witnessed a story of survival, of choices made in the face of danger, and of hearts opening in the most unlikely of places. And as the morning sun bathed the land in gold, there was a quiet understanding between them. Whatever storms the prairie might bring, they would face them together. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, in shared moments of courage, in the warmth of a fire after a night of terror, in the knowledge that someone is willing to stand by your side when the world seems determined to tear you apart. And for Jake and Clara, that love had taken root in the most unlikely of ways, forged in the heart of danger and tempered by the vast, untamed beauty of the Wyoming frontier. As they turned back toward the cabin, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sense of peace, a promise that even in a world full of shadows, light and hope could find a place to grow. And so, amidst the echoes of the past and the quiet strength of the present, a new chapter began. One of trust, resilience, and a love that would endure beyond the prairie, beyond fear, beyond the trials that had once seemed insurmountable. For anyone listening to this story, remember, sometimes the darkest moments reveal the brightest connections. And in the heart of the frontier, or anywhere in life, the courage to protect, the bravery to trust, and the willingness to open your heart can lead to a love stronger than any storm. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.